Okay, the next item of business is debate on motion 20627 in the name of Ash Regan on the Prostitution, Offences and Support Scotland Bill at stage 1. I invite members wishing to participate in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now or as soon as possible. I call on Ash Regan, member in charge, to speak to and move the motion up to 8 minutes. Ms Regan.
Presiding Officer, the world is watching. As the Epstein scandal finally unravels, it exposes something survivors and whistleblowers have been telling us for decades, that sexual exploitation does not persist because no one knows about it. It persists because those with power choose not to act. So we must ask ourselves honestly today, what can Scotland truly say that we have done? Have we listened to survivors, many of whom are in the gallery with us today? And across this chamber, I'm sad to say that shamefully, very few have listened to those survivors. Too often, survivor voices have been drowned out by those with loud platforms, enviable access to power and the presumption to speak over those who have the lived reality. And politicians may write bold strategies on prostitution, yet they repeatedly fail to confront the root cause of sexual exploitation, which of course is the demand to buy sex. In the gallery today and watching from home are survivors who have tried time and time again to be heard. They have submitted evidence, they have spoken to committees, they have attended parliamentary events, reliving that trauma, not for themselves, but to protect the next wee girls from what happened to them. And today they have entrusted me with something profound, to be their agency, to speak truth to power, and to ask this Parliament to finally act. Now, let me be absolutely clear about what this bill does. This unbuyable bill recognises prostitution for what it is, a system of exploitation and violence sustained by demand. It decriminalises those who are sold, recognising them as people constrained by vulnerability and not offenders. And it places criminality and that accountability where it has never properly sat in Scots law, with those who buy sexual access and those who profit from the sale of sexual access to human beings. Now, this is not radical. This is closing a gap in the law that has existed for nearly 20 years. And Police Scotland are clear. They state they're fully supportive. Buying sex is a form of exploitation and it should be covered by law. The majority of those who sell sex are very vulnerable and most are at risk of violence and therefore should be supported and not criminalised. COPFS tell us that while this offending often happens behind closed doors, this does not mean that difficulties are insurmountable. And the Lord Advocate is unequivocal. She said those who purchase sex are statistically more likely to perpetrate domestic abuse and other violence against women and girls, making this, and I quote, a matter of clear public interest and societal harm. And the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls has stated plainly that prostitution constitutes torture, and inhumane or degrading treatment, and is an aggravated form of male violence facilitated by demand. This bill is not out of time. It is overdue. Why now? Because exploitation is not going to wait for more reviews or more consultations or more strategies from the government. People, the electorate did not send us to this chamber to observe the harms that are going on out there outside of this place. They sent us here to act, to do something about it. Public support for this bill is very strong. Yet Scotland remains in the absolutely extraordinary position where protecting women and children from sexual exploitation was not a fully funded Year 1 priority of this government, and after 19 years in power, it has still failed to act. The government's own expert advisor on grooming and child sexual exploitation, Professor Alexis Jay, said in 2018, the big issue is tackling demand, and that demand for sex with children is growing worldwide. And most women in prostitution entered as children. many of them from the care system. Many of them already carrying the scars of sexual abuse, of domestic violence and of trauma. And surely the public expect us and their government to do everything in their power to protect these vulnerable women and children, so why won't they? The UK Anti-Slavery Commissioner has warned of a surge in trafficking, calling it a demand-led crime that grows faster than our own ability to protect victims. This is a market where buyers believe they're never going to be challenged, and that very belief is our collective problem to solve in this place today. For nearly 20 years, inaction has allowed that belief that they have to harden. And while this Parliament, I'm sorry to say, speaks eloquently and at length about equality, but then it's searching for reasons not to act where action is required. Presiding Officer, inaction is not neutrality. It is a decision, and it has a cost. Dismissal of international evidence as contested is not caution. It is intellectual laziness. The data exists if we choose to engage with it. Sweden pioneered the equality model in 1999, criminalising the purchase of sex while supporting exit and recovery. And men consistently report a fear of legal consequences as being that primary deterrent. No Nordic model country has ever reversed their position. No, instead they have strengthened their law, they have expanded support, and they have refined their enforcement. Because once a society decides that human beings are not commodities, it does not go back from that position. And this is what the global sex trade fears, losing its market of misery for profits. And the UN Special Rapporteur, Reem Al-Salem, is clear that prostitution is incompatible with women's equality, and legal frameworks which normalise sex buying entrench violence and discrimination. And her message is that we have a duty to address demand and not manage exploitation. So Sweden, Norway, Iceland, Ireland, France, Canada, they are all demonstrating positive outcomes of this law. They've got reduced demand, they've got fewer people in prostitution, they've got improved safety, they've got world-leading sexual health outcomes. In Sweden, 0 femicides in prostitution in 26 years, the lowest demand for paid sex, world-leading HIV eradication, and strengthened laws to tackle online exploitation. This is not ideology. This is the evidence. And let us remember that Scotland's own legislative history, I'll come to you in a moment. Since 2002, there have been 9 bills on this. There have been, or formal proposals. There have been a dozen consultations, multiple expert groups, and in this instance, a full Stage 1 scrutiny of this bill. So if the answer to this question is another commission, then I think Parliament deserves to know the answer to this question. What is a commission going to tell us that 2 decades of evidence have not already shown us? Now, Presiding Officer, I will take an intervention, but only if I'm going to be given the time back.
You're already over time, Ms Reagan.
Okay,
You're going to have to bring your remarks to a conclusion.
But I would like to put on the record that I have repeatedly asked for more time for this debate. I would normally, when I've taken bills through this Parliament before, I've always wanted to take interventions. I think it's an important part of steering legislation through. So to not be able to take interventions, I'm sorry, but it's a failure of this Parliament.
Ms Reagan, if you could resume your seat a second. Ms Reagan, if you could resume your seat a second. Ms Reagan, if you could resume your seat a second. Ms Reagan, if you could resume your seat a second. No, I'm asking you to resume your seat. I'm asking you to resume your seat. Could you please resume your seat? I will allow you back in a second. What I'm saying to you is the intervention came after the conclusion of your speaking time allowance. So it wasn't as if this was something you were not able to take because you didn't have enough time. You were allocated 8 minutes. I've given you additional time. If you could please bring your remarks to a conclusion, I would be grateful.
Well, I want to make a point to the Chamber about the timing, because that's an issue that the Government has raised. We don't seem to know our own history in here. So the Prostitution, Public Places and Scotland Act that passed in 2007 moved from introduction to enactment within a matter of months, and that was an election year. Stage 1 was in January and Stage 3 was in February. And there was no seeming panic about that, even though it was more complicated than this one. So we've got to ask whose interests are being threatened. Not the little girls in care homes that are being vulnerable to grooming, not the women that are being trafficked as we speak in vans across Europe towards Scotland, not the students that are being lured in by free accommodation, not the abused, not the addicted, not the desperate women that are being coerced by debt and threat. That is the reality of prostitution. Survivors have told us repeatedly that the loudest voices in this debate are the ones who were never for sale, and that is a scandal. And another told us that every delay tells men that they can keep doing what they're doing and that these women, that their lives don't matter.
Bring your remarks to a conclusion, please, Ms Reagan.
Well, Presiding Officer, I will. Unfortunately, again, the Parliament does not allocate enough time to the things that are really desperately important, like saving people's lives. The Equally Safe strategy recognises prostitution as violence against women and girls, yet ministers are asking this Parliament to vote against legislation that enacts that principle. Survivors will notice that contradiction, but so will voters. After nearly 2 decades in power, delay is not caution, it's abdication. So the world is watching. This Parliament must agree, and I think does agree, that prostitution is violence against women. And if you do agree with that, please vote for the principles of this bill, and it is a vote to hold perpetrators of violence to account.
And you can move the motion, please. Could you please move the motion?
Moved.
Thank you. I now call on Audrey Nicholl on behalf of the Criminal Justice Committee, up to 7 minutes. Ms Nicholl.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and I'm very pleased to open in this debate on behalf of the Criminal Justice Committee. And at the outset, can I advise members I have limited time available this afternoon to set out some of the key details from our Stage 1 report. Therefore, if there is time at the end, I will take interventions then. So firstly, I want to thank our excellent clerks team for the support that we have come to expect over the years, to Spice and Pat colleagues who supported us through the complexities of trauma-informed engagement with lived and living experience witnesses. And while I have a deep personal interest in tackling gender-based abuse in Scotland, today I speak as convener and on behalf of the whole committee. The committee approached our scrutiny in a constructive, collegiate manner, and there were many areas of common agreement. The committee is very grateful to all those who gave evidence, particularly those with lived and living experience. We appreciate the bravery and honesty with which you shared your experiences and insight. And in addition to our oral evidence sessions, the committee received a substantial volume of written evidence, setting out strongly held views across both sides of the debate. So our aim has been, within the time available, to allow individuals on both sides of the debate to set out their positions. And in considering the evidence, it cannot be overstated that our overriding collective objective is to reduce the harm associated with prostitution. The committee took a great deal of time to agree and prepare our conclusions and recommendations, and today I want to highlight the main findings in our Stage 1 report. So the most controversial proposal in the bill was a new offence to criminalise the purchase of a sexual act. The challenge we faced in our scrutiny was to determine what the likely impact of the new offence will be and whether, as drafted, it could achieve its stated aims. So in the time available to the committee considered the impact of the proposed offence on demand, on related activities such as human trafficking, and importantly, the implications for policing and prosecution of offences and the safety of women. Now, much of the evidence in this policy area is highly contested, which made reaching conclusions very difficult. However, after careful consideration of the evidence, the committee reached some unanimous conclusions. So first, prostitution causes untold harm and misery for many of those involved. Secondly, we are fully supportive of the overall goal of the member in charge of the bill to reform the laws on prostitution in order to reduce the demand for and the prevalence of prostitution in Scotland. However, we identified concerns with the bill as it was drafted. So a key concern is whether a new criminal offence could be enforced in such a way as to reduce the amount of prostitution in Scotland, as stated in the policy memorandum. Police Scotland stated, and I quote, if we would need to find a model that allows us to be satisfied the crime of the purchase of sex is complete, while Crown Office stressed the importance of managing expectations with regard to the evidential difficulties in proving the offence. Now, this is an offence which would invariably take place in private, may be arranged online, and can involve highly vulnerable individuals who may be reluctant to give evidence to secure a conviction. We also heard concerns about the definition of a sexual act, including that behaviours excluded from the definition could be confusing. If you can bear with me, I'll take you in, if I have time at the end, Mr Ewing. But our overriding concern is the evidence we heard about the impact of the proposed offence as drafted on the safety of women. Supporters of the bill told us there is no reliable evidence that the model proposed would make women more unsafe. However, we heard concerns that criminalising the buyer may drive prostitution underground and make it less safe for those selling at. I'll come back to Ms Maguire if I've got time. We consider that there is more to be done to properly engage with and address the genuine concerns expressed that the offence would compromise women's safety. On the other proposals in the bill, we believe that there is merit in the proposal to repeal the offence of soliciting. This was widely supported by witnesses, although the Scottish Government's view is that this would require further consultation. On the proposal to quash convictions for soliciting, we understand the policy intention, but we heard evidence that an alternative approach based around pardons would be preferable. And we agree with the general policy intention in the bill that individuals who are or have been in prostitution should receive assistance and support. However, we have concerns about the adequacy of the funding levels proposed in this bill.
Ms Nicholl, if you could resume your seat. Point of order, Michelle Thompson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, for taking my point of order. Given the level of interest in this debate, I think it's reasonable to assume everybody in here will have read the Stage 1 report. And with respect to the convener, this is a debate. So I don't think there's any material benefit to taking interventions after all the main points have been made. And so I wonder whether she would reflect whether she's willing to have a debate.
That is not a point of order, and point of order should not be made as interventions. Audrey Nicholl.
I thank Michelle Thompson for her intervention. My position is that I think it is really important that I set out the position of the committee, and I am very happy to take interventions at the end of my contribution. So if I may proceed. Presiding Officer, taking into account all the evidence we received, some committee members were content to recommend the bill should progress to Stage 2. Others consider there is insufficient time to undertake the necessary detailed consultation and engagement required to properly address the issue of women's safety and make other necessary changes. Therefore, they do not consider the bill should proceed beyond Stage 1. However, we are all agreed that prostitution is a form of violence against women and girls. Its prevalence must be reduced, and further action is necessary as a matter of priority. We were all of the view that if passed at Stage 1, significant amendments to the bill will be required to address the concerns we have identified. And finally, if the bill was not to succeed, we set out some views on what should happen next, including the establishment of an independent commission. And I note the Scottish Government response to our Stage 1 report sets out a commitment to a commission that would identify options for the next government to consider. So prior to concluding, Presiding Officer, if I have time, I'll take interventions.
You're over time now, Ms Nicholl. Thank you. I now call on Siobhan Brown,
May I just
Minister.
conclude my remarks, Presiding Officer? So just to conclude, I do want to extend our thanks again to everyone who supported the committee's scrutiny, and I look forward to hearing members' contributions. Thank you.
Point of order, Douglas Ross.
The first two speakers in this debate, and I rise as someone hoping to speak, the member in charge and the convener of the lead committee have both questioned the time constraints that have been allocated to this debate. That is only going to continue, Presiding Officer, as more members seek to make points in a debate and hopefully take interventions and make interventions. Therefore, can I request, if you will consider a motion without notice, to extend this debate to allow future speakers full time to have a debate, including the member in charge when she is summing up this debate, because this Parliament is able to change the rules at a whim to allow much to be debated late into the evening. Surely this is something that should be debated late into this evening.
Thank you, Mr Ross. In response to your point of order, this is a matter that has been considered by the Bureau at some length, with contributions including from the member in charge and all parties. I'm not minded to take a motion without notice on that basis. I now call Siobhan Brown, Minister, up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, I want to begin by commending Ash Regan on the work that she has undertaken on this bill, bringing prostitution to the top of the political agenda. Through the Stage 1 process, Parliament has been able to hear directly from women who have lived experience of prostitution, and that would not have happened if it wasn't for without this bill. And as I've said throughout, yes.
Ash Regan.
I've been very concerned, and I would have made an intervention on the committee convener had she had time to do that, about this seeming lack of comparativeness between those that are advancing, saying they don't agree with the bill, who say they have lived experience, and survivors with lived experience. Can the Minister explain why she met with lobby groups and people saying they didn't agree with the bill, but she refused to meet with the survivors who could have told her about the real reality of prostitution?
Minister.
I'm sorry, I do not think that's an accurate reflection at all from Ms Regan. Absolutely not. And as I have said throughout, the bill has reinforced the clear, unequivocal position that prostitution is violence against women and girls. It is the Scottish Government's view, as set out in our Equally Safe strategy, that men should not be able to purchase sex. Quite simply, women are not for sale. I also want to thank the committee for their scrutiny, which has been thoughtful and considered. And I'm also grateful to all of those who provided evidence and those who have written and have met with me. And I recognise that sharing personal experiences can be hard, and I'm grateful for them for doing so. I will take an intervention in a moment, if I can just make a little bit of progress. I also acknowledge the important role of the cross-party group that they have played in ensuring that the social implications of commercial sexual exploitation, including trafficking and prostitution, have remained a matter of priority throughout this Parliament. Presiding Officer, the Chamber is aware that the Scottish Government regretfully cannot support the bill at Stage 1 due to the short time left in this session to address the significant issues. I think I need to be clear. This bill was introduced 8 months ago. If perhaps the member had brought it in May 2024, we could maybe have worked together to get in. Presiding Officer, the Chamber is aware that the Scottish Government regretfully cannot support the bill. Whilst the Scottish Government strongly supports the principle of criminalising those who purchase sex, the bill's aims to protect women. Legislating on principle alone is not sufficient to ensure that we deliver that aim. And it is necessary to have a workable, effective bill that can command the confidence of Parliament. I'll take from
Carol Mochan.
The Minister taking an intervention. You talk about how important this is and that you do see that this could be a bill that we could work with. Are there any amendments that would make us be able to move this forward tonight?
Always through the Chair, Minister.
Yes, and I'll come to that. I do not believe, as we've got only 6 weeks left, one of the issues is the support. There is no detail to the support in this bill, and we would like to consult, especially with women who are currently in prostitution, about what support they would like, and we would not have time to do that in the next couple of weeks, let alone months. Those providing evidence to the committee, and indeed the committee itself, have pointed to concerns that some women involved in prostitution say that their their safety will be at risk. Without the necessary time to consult and to develop proposals to ensure their safety, we therefore cannot support the bill as drafted. Presiding Officer, the committee report clearly outlines the differing... I will take an intervention from Michelle Thompson.
Michelle Thompson, briefly.
I appreciate the Minister taking an intervention. The Government has provided a shadow bill team to assist on other legislation it's neutral on. Given the principle in this bill is a long-standing SNP policy, why not this one?
Minister.
Sorry, but we didn't have the official support for a shadow bill on this particular bill. Presiding Officer, the committee report clearly outlines the differing perspectives on this bill and also offers a clear route map that I agree should lead to informed and deliverable next steps. Those next steps need to be reflective of and how to respond to how commercial sexual exploitation is taking place now in 2026 and how the challenges of online activity that did not exist when the Nordic model was first introduced can be addressed. If I could just ask members, can I please make a bit of progress? I will take interventions, but there's people screaming from the back, and I think we should show a little bit of respect. I'll take an intervention from Ruth.
Ruth Maguire, briefly.
Thank you. I appreciate the Minister giving way. On tackling online prostitution, in response to the Cross-Party Group's 2021 report into online pimping, the Scottish Government was very quick to point out that they didn't have the levers to address online matters. It's a little bit concerning that they're knowing this fact, they're using that as a reason to not legislate for this matter.
Minister.
Yes, I think one of the things is it is a reserved matter, but even moving forward, and I think this is one of the things that Police Scotland have said in their evidence sessions to the committee, that online activity is a huge issue in prostitution these days, and they need to be able to enforce any legislation that goes through. So even though it is a reserved matter, I think we have to put it all into context of that moving forward. Those next steps need to be reflective of and to respond to how commercial sexual exploitation is taking place now in 2026 and the challenges of online activity that did not exist when the Nordic model was first introduced can be addressed. That is why the Scottish Government welcomes and supports the committee's recommendation that an independent commission be established to consider these issues and to have a clear remit and timescale for reporting. Presiding Officer, let me outline 3 steps this Government will take forward on the committee's recommendations. First, I've instructed officials to immediately work on the establishment of a commission so the options are available for the next responsible minister in the next Government. These will be ready on the first day so that, as this Government will do if they are returned, a commission can be established at pace. Second, if the Government is returned, we will ensure that such a commission is time-limited so that legislation can be put before MSPs as early as possible, informed by the Commission and public consultation. I can commit today for my party that we will introduce legislation. And third, the committee asks the Government to provide support for relevant support services. The draft budget includes £400,000 to further support implementation of our strategic approach to challenge demand for prostitution, and we'll also be providing an additional £65,000 in the next financial year for the Women's Support Project, improving access to services and supporting women exiting prostitution. Presiding Officer, if I can now turn to detail of the bill which we retain significant... Okay, sorry, Presiding Officer, I know. Before I finish, I do want to mention, please, Scotland's national... I'm sorry, I do not have any time for interventions. I will conclude by saying that, again, I regret that we can't support this bill as drafted, given there is not enough sufficient time to develop the proposals and amendments that are needed to address the very significant concerns we have with the bill. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Minister. Point of order, Douglas Ross.
Now we've had the member in charge, the convener of the Lead Committee and the Government Minister responding to this debate, all claiming they don't have enough time, not just to take interventions, which the Minister did, but to finish her remarks. What does it take to get you to agree to a motion without notice to extend this debate?
Mr Ross, this is the same point of order you've raised. I've explained to you why I am not prepared to accept a motion without notice. This is a matter that has been considered extensively by the Bureau over multiple sessions and with a member in charge, and Parliament has set a timing motion which I am going to adhere to. Point of order, Stephen Kerr.
Given what you have just said to the Chamber about many meetings of the Bureau. Here we are now in this Stage 1 debate. We can see how things are going. Many people had anticipated it might be like this. Is there a possibility, or are things so inflexible in our Parliament, is there a possibility that the Bureau could meet, as they have on many occasions, at the back door here or in a committee room, and decide to give the flexibility that clearly is now needed, as Douglas Ross has made clear, as other speakers have made clear, the flexibility is needed to properly consider the principles of this bill?
Mr Kerr, that is a point of order you may wish to raise with your business manager. It's not something on which I am going to opine at this stage. I'm keen to protect the time we do have available. There are a number of members beyond those who had a right to speak in this debate to participate. I am doing my best to ensure that they have that right at the end of the debate, but that will require members to stick to their speaking time allocation. Liam Kerr, up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. At stage 1 of a bill, the Parliament debates the general principles of that bill, not whether it should become law. This bill seeks to reduce the amount of prostitution in Scotland because of the evidence of exploitation and the harms that it is causing. It does this principally through creating a new criminal offence of paying for sexual acts. The Minister accepts the fundamental principle of criminalising the purchase of sex because, as she says, prostitution is violence against women and girls. On this, we agree. The bill also proposes to repeal the offence of soliciting, quash convictions for certain offences and provide a right to assistance and support. The Minister then goes on to say that the bill before us requires a great deal of work if it is to achieve its goals. On that, I agree as well. For example, I am concerned about the definition of the offence of paying for the performance of a sexual act. I have concerns about the quashing provisions, which I'm not sure are competent and could offend the separation of powers. I'm concerned at Police Scotland warning the cost of this bill could be at least £320 million. And I do have significant concerns on the effect the offence proposed may have on the safety of women involved in prostitution. May I come back? Sorry, I really want to get to the next bit first, Michelle Thompson. Because, Presiding Officer, this is where I diverge completely from what the Minister has just said. Because surely, as Ash Regan passionately reminded us, if we have an opportunity to reduce violence against women and girls, then we must explore it. And that means progressing this bill to stage 2. Presiding Officer, the Minister says that there is insufficient time left to make this bill work. My observation is that when this government wants to do something, it finds the time to do it. Yeah. When it wanted to release criminals early from prisons, it found time and avoided consultation by forcing through emergency legislation. When the Victims Bill initially contained the utterly appalling suggestion of removing trial by jury, the government pushed it to stage 2, removed the entire part, then debated nearly 300 stage 2 amendments over 4 committee sittings. Similarly, the Land Reform Bill, 550 stage 2 amendments, 5 committee sittings, 4 weeks, not just now. The Natural Environment Bill, 350 amendments at stage 2, 4 committee sittings. The Legal Services Bill, 650 amendments, 2 sittings. Presiding Officer, there are 7.5 weeks left until dissolution. But perhaps it's the time for stage 3 amendments and debate that is the concern. Well, I recall being required to sit until 10:30 at night, then restarting at 8 o'clock the following morning on the then government's performative and pejorative continuity bills. Just last week, we were here until 10 o'clock at night, then 10:30 on consecutive days to debate 200 amendments to pass the government's Natural Environment Bill, which suggests to me that the time is there unless the government doesn't want it to be. Presiding Officer, there's one more key thing which concerns me here. What became the Hate Crime Act omitted sex as a protected characteristic within its new offences. Many MSPs tried to include it, but the government instead promised us the Misogyny Act, a promise the government abandoned last summer, citing lack of time. Instead, the government says sex will now be added as a protected characteristic from April 2027. And the Minister said there isn't the time for proper engagement and consultation. Well, just a fortnight ago, I stood in this very spot and heard a similar excuse for not bringing in a statutory offence of non-fatal strangulation, an act of violence disproportionately done by men to women. But I have since discovered that the consultation won't finish until well into the next session of Parliament, despite the fact that the first clear mention of a statutory offence against non-fatal strangulation in this chamber that I can find was December 2024. Yet, as we have heard this afternoon, the consultation on letting criminals out after only 30% of their sentence, consultation needed 1 week. But hey, at least we made time last week to pass stage 1 of the Greyhound Bill and send it to stage 2, even though there isn't any greyhound racing in Scotland. Presiding Officer, this bill has as its aim the reduction of violence against women and girls. It is flawed, but it just might, with amendments and determination, achieve that protection and reduce the violence. And if it might, we have a duty, we have an obligation to try. The government says there is not time. I say make the time. That's why I shall vote for it to proceed at stage 2 at decision time tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Kerr. I now call on Pauline McNeill. Up to 6 minutes, Ms McNeill.
Let's be clear, prostitution is a form of violence against women and girls, and it can never be made safe. That is the Scottish Government's position. Why they didn't take forward their promise in their programme for government is a mystery to me. And it would have had the resources of government, and we wouldn't be talking about this right now, about why we're running out of time. It is a dangerous occupation because there's no other profession or women at such a risk of harm. We live in a world where men are dominant, more physically powerful, and the main perpetrators of violence against women and girls are men. This fact is supported by the brave individuals who attended the committee and shared their lived experience of assault, intimidation, rape and other forms of violence. Violence was described by many as normalised and frequently underreported. The cumulative effect was long-term trauma, hypervigilance and symptoms consistent with complex PTSD. Prostitution is simply not a job like any other. Reducing prostitution and giving women real choices is a view shared by most of the witnesses that we heard from, but I want to thank all the women who gave us their views for or against the bill, and I respect every one of them. But I want to be crystal clear, Scottish Labour does not support the decriminalisation model as implemented in New Zealand. In New Zealand, it is described as harmless fun for men and even empowering for women. We heard from a 19-year-old survivor who said she was raped after consenting to oral sex, and she described being powerless to set boundaries with men who just simply take what they want. The bill is based on the Nordic model and criminalises the sex buyer while decriminalising the seller. But it is fundamentally about recognising that it is a guaranteed way to harm women and get away with it. But it's also about exiting prostitution and saying that it is okay to leave and you will be supported. There is strong evidence that countries have implemented a form of the Nordic model, see a reduction in sex trafficking. Now, this is obviously a distinct issue, but a serious crime. But I think this alone would justify supporting the general principles of the bill. One thing is certain, we cannot continue with the current system which criminalises largely vulnerable women but does not criminalise men. And it looks like we'll get to the end of this Parliament and we will still not criminalise men but criminalise women. And they think it's perfectly valid to buy women's bodies. Survivors who are brave enough to speak of the horrible things that they have been asked to do by men, such as wear their daughters' clothes, be gang raped by friends, are just some of the examples that speak to the wider societal harm by allowing the concept of men buying sex. Now, last night, if you saw the news, you will have seen that men are filming women on nights out, sharing it as content, and they're making a fortune out of it. You've got to understand the wider harms of being able to sell sex. It's visible to everyone. This Parliament, like every other Parliament across the world, who claims to challenge the trajectory of male violence, must find a route to deal with the uneven power dynamic within prostitution, where it is overwhelmingly women who are exploited and men causing harm. And for those who are saying that sex work is a choice, it is not a true choice for most women who are driven into prostitution through poverty and other traumatic circumstances. So we heard some evidence that decriminalising the sale of sex would allow for sex buyers to be screened. But others say it's exceptionally difficult for women to refuse buyers. The one former sex worker said of her most violent experience happened in a brothel. She said that she was choked and hurt by a man when she begged him to stop, and he didn't. She recounted that there were panic buttons installed in the rooms, a buzzer entry system to the premises, a sign-in system where punters used fake names, as well as cameras outside, and other girls who promised to help if something went wrong. But she said, when it came down to it, none of these security measures made any difference. And in the end, she said, you are shut in a room with a man who's purchased your body and is almost always going to be significantly stronger than you. And she said in her experience, that men thrive on anonymity. Dr Emma Forbes from the Crown Office said that those men who are involved in buying sex are more likely to be perpetrators of domestic abuse and involved in other forms of violence against women and girls more broadly in our society through the treatment of other women. This is Scotland's Crown Office. I'll take a short intervention from Rona Mackay.
I thank the member for taking the intervention. Would the member acknowledge that brothel keeping is not part of this bill?
Yes, because brothel keeping is already an offence when it hasn't gone underground. In a similar vein, Detective Superintendent Bertram said that when dealing with men who buy sex, Police Scotland has found that most have a really bad criminal history involving violence against women, with both out with domestic settings, including a lot of serious offending to sexual crime. I personally believe that a society that allows men to pay for sex effectively encourages men to view women as commodities, and I don't think that can be isolated from ingrained misogyny in society. I believe ultimately prostitution feeds men's entitlements, and that's what many survivors say, and generally women's lack of self-worth. On a societal level, it works to maintain male dominance and female insubordination. I do believe, as I've said, there should have been a government bill for reasons that are not clear as to why they didn't. The whole committee were completely dissatisfied with the time that was allowed to scrutinise this bill, and at that we were at 1. Today we're dealing with the general principles. We're not dealing with a bill that's perfect. We're being asked to support or not support the general principles. Scottish Labour are clear that there would have to be further consideration of some of the bigger issues and some amendment to the bill. But today, we will be supporting the general principles when it comes to decision time. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call Maggie Chapman. Up to 6 minutes, Ms Chapman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Scottish Greens support workers, retail workers, hospitality workers, healthcare workers, care workers, and yes, sex workers. Because sex work is work. It might not be work one agrees with. It might not be work one would ever do. One might not ever procure the services of a sex worker. But some people do that work. Many of them do it out of their own free will. They find it meaningful and fulfilling work. It earns them a good living and puts food on their table. I do accept that this is not the case for all. For those who turn to sex work out of sheer desperation, there should be clear supports in place to allow them to get out of that work into a job they actually want to do. We cannot and we must not ignore the systemic barriers that drive some people into sex work they would prefer not to do. Poverty, disability, caring responsibilities, and a lack of viable alternatives. But we also cannot legislate these issues away by punishing clients and, by extension, workers. And those who coerce or traffic sex workers should feel the full force of the law. But for those who do this work, do it freely and get value from it, who are we to make it harder and less safe to do? We should never make policy without listening to those who it impacts, and the vast majority of workers are against criminalising the purchase of sex. I'll take an intervention from Ruth Maguire briefly.
Do a brief intervention. If prostitution is work like any other, should we be offering it as work experience for young people? Should folk who are going for job seekers, should their benefits be taken away if they refuse to do it?
Maggie Chapman.
I thank Ruth Maguire for that intervention. it is a different kind of work, and there are lots of types of work that are not offered for work experience, for the examples that she gives. But I think one of the important points of this bill is that many sex workers believe that this bill would make them less safe. Indeed, as one sex worker told the committee, and I quote, "I currently fully vet all of my clients with legal ID and bank transfer deposits. The proposed bill would mean this would be unfeasible. I am safe as I know who I am encountering, but criminalising clients means only those who are willing to break the law will seek out services and therefore be less compliant with my current safety measures." Amnesty International has documented the impact of end demand legislation on the human rights of sex workers in Norway, Ireland and France, and found that it compromises sex worker safety by involving them in criminalisation as police look for clients, or it criminalises third parties, such as landlords. Evidence from other countries show that making sex work less visible does not eliminate demand. It merely pushes sex workers further underground, increasing their vulnerability to violence and abuse. Workers are forced into more precarious interactions in less safe locations, with less ability to demand safer working conditions or agree on boundaries. That is not protection. That is punishment. This is even more likely with this bill, because it does not decriminalise brothel keeping, defined as where more than one sex worker works in the same place. Not permitting sex workers to legally work together indoors has the effect of making sex workers more isolated, more vulnerable to potential violence. In other words, more at risk of harm. And sex workers will be more unsafe, not just from violent clients, but from stigma and the associated harms of that stigma. The stigma associated with prostitution prevents sex workers getting appropriate healthcare, and criminalisation will stigmatise workers as well as clients. Evidence from around the world has shown a clear link between criminalisation and sex workers' increased risk of HIV, STIs and poor emotional health. That's why experts who have experienced the Nordic model support decriminalisation. Researchers from the LSE conducted 210 formal interviews with sex workers, police, social workers and policymakers in Sweden, Norway and Finland. Of these, 96% opposed the sex bylaws in those countries. The research found that even without direct criminalisation of sex workers are de facto penalised through the enforcement of intersecting immigration, third-party and fiscal policies. It finds that policing still targets sex workers, with ramifications including evictions and deportations. I do want to address the issue of the trafficking of people for sex work. Trafficking people to force them into sex work is reprehensible, but we do not need new law to tackle that. That law already exists. As the English Collective of Prostitutes have said, and I quote, "We have to look at the effectiveness of the law in that regard and the effectiveness of the support for victims of trafficking. But that is completely unconnected to the question of criminalising clients." The committee heard that there is no evidence from Sweden or other countries that criminalise the purchase of sex that such laws have an impact on trafficking. We can and should crack down on traffickers, but we can do that without harassing people who are just trying to earn a living. And there is another way, as sex workers themselves have said. Full decriminalisation of sex work, of purchase and of running locations where sex work happens can create the space for collective safety. It allows sex workers to work together, to unionise, to support one another, to access healthcare, housing and social security, and to work in safe spaces without the looming threat of being dragged into criminal justice processes. Scotland for Decrim argues that only by fully removing punitive laws do sex workers gain, and I quote, "the power to choose when and how we work." The power and the dignity of their labour that all other workers should have. Sex workers are simply asking for that same treatment. As a Scottish Green, I'm concluding, Presiding Officer, as a Scottish Green, I believe deeply in harm reduction, social justice and bodily autonomy. Where sex where sex work happens between consenting adults, I believe the state should support people, not penalise them for how they choose to live and work.
You do need to conclude.
We must trust sex workers with their own lives. We must listen to them and we must follow their demands. We stand for sex workers' rights in Scotland, for safety, dignity and freedom.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms Chapman. Before calling the next speaker, could I please discourage members from shouting out from a sedentary position? I understand the frustration if an intervention is not accepted by the speaker, but it is up to the person with the microphone to decide whether or not they take the intervention. Alex Cole-Hamilton, up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, before I begin my remarks, can I pay tribute to the member in charge of this bill? And whilst my party's position, through long-established party policy, is at odds with hers, I do recognise her tenacity and the passion with which she has committed herself to the work behind this bill. This bill proposes, Presiding Officer, a number of changes to the current legal framework relating to sex work. In particular, it would introduce a new criminal offence, repeal the existing offence of soliciting for the purposes of prostitution in a public place, overturn convictions under that offence, and place a statutory duty on ministers to provide support to people who currently or have previously worked in prostitution. That support could include accommodation, financial and material assistance, counselling services and healthcare. I want to state at the outset that my party wholeheartedly agree that access to appropriate support services is vital and that no one should be prevented from seeking help because of stigma and fear. I will give way to Fergus Ewing.
Fergus Ewing, please.
Thank you for giving way. If that's the case, and Section 6, the right of support, is supported by the Liberal Democrats, then surely it may be the case that that might be the only part of this bill that's left. It's not my view, but it is a possible outcome, and therefore, logically, the Lib Dems should be supporting the bill to allow that right of support to be passed by Parliament and do something good for women, the most abused women in the land.
Alex Cole-Hamilton.
I'm grateful for Fergus Ewing's intervention. I think that there are aspects of this bill that absolutely we support, but I'm going to come on to the reasons why we can't tonight in its entirety. And as I say, we won't be supporting it. Our position on this issue has been established for some time. We believe in a policy of decriminalising sex work in line with international best practice, do not support the adoption of a model proposed in this legislation. That position is informed by available evidence and by the experience of other jurisdictions. While the bill is intended to reduce harm, the criminalising of the purchase of sex has not consistently achieved that outcome in practice. Evidence from countries that have taken this approach indicates that it can result in increased marginalisation of sex workers, reduced visibility of activity and additional barriers to accessing support services. I'll give way to the member in charge.
I think the problem we're wrestling with here is that as legislators, it's our job to engage with the data and the evidence. And it's fine for people to have opinions. So people can have an opinion. They can say, oh, I think this might make me more safe. But it's not supported in the evidence. The evidence that's been submitted to the committee from the other side of this debate, we analysed it ourselves because the committee were unwilling to do it. And the approach of the Nordic model is the only model that reduces harm.
Alex Cole-Hamilton.
I recognise the work that the member in charge has done on this, but we have also done work behind our preparation for today's debate and recognise that the experience of jurisdictions like Australia suggests that that is not the case, that actually we can't wish prostitution away. And as it will forever exist, we need to make sure that it happens in the safest possible way, and that is why my party embraces the idea of criminalisation and the evidence brought forward by other jurisdictions who have gone before us. Evidence from countries that have taken this approach indicate that it can result in, as I say, increased marginalisation. There is also evidence suggesting that where buyers are criminalised, sex workers may have less opportunity to assess risk, may be pushed towards more isolated locations, and may be less likely to report concerns to the police. These factors are relevant when assessing whether the approach proposed in the bill delivers its stated objectives. In contrast, where sex work has been decriminalised, evidence points to improved engagement between sex workers and public authorities, increased reporting of violence and abuse, greater access to health and support services, and improved working conditions. Decriminalisation has also been associated with a clearer distinction between consensual sex work and exploitation. It frees up police time to focus on the harm, allowing enforcement efforts to focus more directly on coercion, on trafficking and on abuse. We recognise the inclusion in the bill of a duty of ministers to provide support. However, we're not persuaded that introducing a new criminal offence alongside that duty represents the most effective or coherent policy framework. In our view, support services are more effective where they are delivered independently of criminalisation and where individuals can engage with services without fear of wider legal consequences. For the Scottish Liberal Democrats, the central test of any legislation in this area, and this speaks to Fergus Ewing's intervention, is whether it demonstrably reduces harm, improves safety and enables access to support. On the basis of the evidence currently available, the empirical evidence, we do not believe that this bill meets that test. Presiding Officer, this is a complex policy area and it is appropriate that Parliament debates it and considers a range of perspectives as a bill like this progresses. We'll engage with that process in good faith if it passes tonight. However, for the reasons I've set out, the Scottish Liberal Democrats cannot support the bill as it is.
Thank you. We now move to the open debate. I call first Jamie Hepburn to be followed by Sharon Dowie. Up to 6 minutes, Mr Hepburn.
I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak in this Stage 1 debate and to set out my perspective on the bill, informed by my experience as a member of the Criminal Justice Committee and just having taken evidence on that. I recognise the work that Ash Regan has done to advance this bill, having been responsible for taking forward various pieces of legislation as a government minister. I know how onerous a task that can be, and I therefore do not underestimate the challenges involved in advancing a Members' Bill. I am grateful and thankful to my colleagues on the committee for the collaborative and, as the convener set out, collegiate fashion in which we work together to pull together a Stage 1 report, which I believe is as comprehensive a one as we could have pulled together in the context of the time we had available to us. And indeed, Ash Regan herself welcomed the approach we had taken when she was before the committee on the 26th of November. The matter of time is one that I want to pick up on, which has been instrumental to where I have ended up on the bill. I do not believe that the committee has had the requisite time required to consider the matters at hand in this bill. As Pauline McNeill set out, that is a shared perspective of all on the committee, as set out at paragraph 406 of our committee report. I do believe we could have benefited from more time to look at the bill in greater detail. With the bill being introduced only just a month before the deadline for Members' Bills, it left us little time to consider it as fully as I would have liked. That is not, I should say, criticism of the member in charge, as I recognise she was unable to draw down support from the Non-Government Bills Unit due to their lack of capacity to be able to do so. Presiding Officer, one thing I think, and again this has informed my experience of considering this bill, one thing I think we need to consider is the capacity of Parliament to support its members to take forward and to refine legislation. We are, after all, a legislature, and I'll give way briefly to...
Briefly, Michelle Thompson.
I really appreciate giving way. During the Stage 1 scrutiny, I know the committee sought comparative evidence from various other authorities and other jurisdictions, Republic of Ireland, Sweden, Northern Ireland and so on, and responses were received. And I know the report says that the correspondence was received, but beyond noting its existence, the report doesn't summarise, analyse or quote from or otherwise engage with the content. And there was a period of 2 months from final evidence to the Stage 1 report on the 23rd of January. What was going on in those 2 months that could have been used for time to address some of these things?
What was going on was a consideration of the wide-ranging evidence that was provided to us, including the evidence that has been cited. All of that evidence is available for any member of this Parliament and the public to draw upon. It's all been published. It's all publicly available. One of the challenges we have faced in respect of some of the international evidence, again, has been there's been competing points of view on that evidence, and I'll come to that again if I have time. Presiding Officer, the stated purpose of this bill, as set out in its policy memorandum, which sets out that it's to reduce the amount of prostitution in Scotland because of the evidence of exploitation, the harms it is causing, is one I think we all instinctively support, ensuring the safety of women who make up the overwhelming number of those selling sex in Scotland is what we should strive for. It should be our collective aim, and it has been the starting point at which I have approached consideration of the bill. I was very taken with the point that was made in one of our evidence sessions by one of our witnesses who I recognise supports the bill, who set out of prostitution, and I quote from the official report, "The Nordic model does not proclaim it will make it safe. In my personal experience, it can never be made safe." So the question then, and the one I was grappling with, is whether or not the terms of the bill make it more or less safe for those women and girls who are involved in the sale of sex. In considering this, the committee has been confronted, as I've said, with different points of view. Those that I've considered most important are from the women who had lived experience, who took their time to engage with the evidence-gathering process. I am grateful for them doing so. I know it would not have been an easy thing for them to have done. There is, at the very least, Presiding Officer, a perception from some of those who remain involved in the sale of sex that the provisions of this bill will make it less safe for them. They have said so publicly. They stated it and put it on the record. I'm afraid I won't be giving way to you, Ms Maguire. The arguments as to why they fear this is the case have been well aired, and I'm not going to rehearse all of those arguments again. Again, they're all on the public record. What I would say to Parliament is that these are concerns that require to be taken seriously and not to be lightly dismissed. And in the context of what I believe is the limited amount of time that we have had, I do not feel that we've been able to adequately scrutinise that area. I cannot earnestly say that I have been able to satisfy myself beyond any reasonable doubt that this bill does not make it less safe for women selling sex. Now, what I would say is with more... Of course, I'll give you...
Briefly, Ash Regan.
It's directly to that point, and I'm wondering if the member and indeed the committee would have been able to satisfy themselves on that point a little bit better if they hadn't engaged with the lived experience panel that was against the bill, and they had in fact engaged in person with the survivors who are for the bill.
Jamie Hepburn.
Again, the committee made efforts through the organisation. I can't remember the name of the organisation, so I'm not going to guess what it was. But there was an effort to seek to engage with that group of women, and what we were informed is it was difficult for them to come forward. Now, I see Ms Regan shaking her head. That is what we were told. We were told that explicitly. If the question is, would I have liked to have heard directly from those voices on the same basis, the answer is yes, I would. But we were told that was not possible. President Officer, I see I've got to come to close, but I go back to that fundamental point. If there had been more time for us to consider this bill, it may be that I would have been able to stand here and say I was satisfied beyond doubt that this bill would not put women selling sex in jeopardy. We've not had the time to do that. I think we need more time to look at this, to consider it fully, and on that basis, at this stage, I cannot support this bill.
Thank you. I now call Shan Dowie to be followed by Michelle Thompson. Up to 4 minutes, Ms Dowie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. During the scrutiny of this bill, my colleagues and I in the Criminal Justice Committee have heard of the trauma and devastation that involvement in prostitution can cause. This morning, Ash Regan shared with us experiences of some survivors in prostitution. These experiences struck me, and I believe it's important that we listen to survivors. Vanessa MacLeod recounts that she felt little more than an object, an item of purchased property that men felt entitled to use however they wanted. She wrote of her experience leaving her feeling traumatised so severely that she was stuck in a never-ending cycle of fear, flashbacks and panic. Eradicating it is clearly not an easy task, but as elected representatives, we are duty-bound to do our best to try. We believe much of this bill will support that cause, even if there is room for improving and tightening up some of the ideas within it. I thank Ash Regan for bringing this important bill to the Parliamentary Chamber. However, whilst we are nearing the end of this parliamentary term, I am concerned we may not have enough time to work out the required amendments. But I am disappointed that the SNP government are prepared to reject the bill without trying. Given that SNP have brought bills to this chamber that required, as Liam had said earlier on, hundreds of amendments, if they wanted to, they could, or they could at least try. It is absolutely right that the burden of criminality is taken away from vulnerable people at one end of the scale, many of whom are victims of serious crime, and moved on to the powerful, coercive and opportunistic users at the other end. There is evidence from other countries that many of the measures proposed in this bill would have a positive impact, but there is also evidence that, if not done properly, it might not have the meaningful impact it is designed to have. As things stand, crimes associated with prostitution are rising, and many victims of human trafficking and coercion are victims of sexual exploitation. We must ensure that, along with creating a new offence, our authorities have the power and the tools to enforce that. I'm glad to see Police Scotland are supportive of the bill, but they must also fret about their capabilities when it comes to acting on any new laws, given the most recent estimate of over £321 million to enforce this bill. Another budget, and again, the police will not receive the uplift in funding they need. Our hard-working justice sector has been struggling for years under this SNP government. Audit Scotland recently reported that there was no evidence that 16,500 officers is the right number to deliver effective policing for the future. In statistics published just today, we see that once again the number of police officers in Scotland has dropped. 10 years ago, Scotland had 17,263 officers. The latest figures show that we now only have 16,416. Proper enforcement requires resources, and I would urge the SNP government to finally ensure our police force is sufficiently resourced. Presiding officer, we know the vast majority of sex workers are pushed into the trade by a range of disastrous circumstances. Vanessa MacLeod was sold into prostitution aged just 17 because she risked becoming homeless and a friend took advantage of her. Human trafficking and exploitation, poverty, lack of opportunity, substance abuse, family breakdown and a lack of decent housing are all contributing factors. As a result, it's welcome that the member has included a right to support in our bill for those in or exiting the industry. However, I said at the beginning of my speech, the bill is not perfect. There are also those voices who have raised serious concerns, and we must not dismiss them. I believe that addressing some questions and points raised about the bill could help strengthen it and further the positive impact it could have in Scotland. However, before we get there today, I would like to reaffirm that we support the principles here. We appreciate the severity of this matter, appreciate the survivors for sharing their experiences with us, and agree with Ash Regan that solving these problems should be of utmost importance. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Dowie. And I call Michelle Thompson to be followed by Rhoda Grant. Up to 6 minutes. Ms Thompson.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Firstly, I was disappointed in the committee report in Stage 1. Not because I simply disagreed with its conclusions, but because the committee did not fulfil its fundamental role of scrutinising contested evidence. Parliament relies on committees to distinguish robust evidence from ideology and self-interest, and to discriminate between the quality and accuracy of submissions. Yet this report gives them equal weight. And as a result, no credible claim can be made that there is evidence this bill will cause harm to women. There is only the opinion of a small number of self-interested bodies. I'll give room to Rona Mackay.
Rona Mackay, briefly.
Thank you for giving way. I'm not sure if the member's aware, but the member in charge didn't consult with women who are currently working in the sex trade. Surely she consulted with people who had exited the trade. So when I raised this in committee, the safety concerns, the serious safety concerns that we heard, she said that were a myth. Do you believe that those safety concerns are a myth?
Always through the chair. Michelle Thompson.
I'm in the process of making an argument specifically why the committee report has to be tested. And I'm going to fold in all of that, and because I would go on and say, furthermore, there is clear evidence of bias, both in the committee's report and in the government's response. So, for example, the report records that some committee members attended an informal meeting facilitated by Scotland for Decriminalisation, enabling direct engagement with those participants. Yet no no equivalent access was afforded to the Women's Support Project or model for Scotland. This is, no I won't, this is a textbook example of two types, I've gotten one already, of bias. Confirmation bias and motivational bias. I'll finish this section, a deadly combination. And when evidence is filtered through bias, the resulting recommendations cannot command the confidence of Parliament. I'll finish one bit and then I'll take an intervention. Consequently, the Government's 6-page response to the committee report is less than compelling. Surely it would have been more honest and more democratic to gather the true views of Parliament by allowing a free vote, especially when, due to the coming election, the bill will ultimately fall regardless, and the Government claims it will seek to bring forward legislation as soon as possible if re-elected. I'll give way to Audrey.
Audrey Nicholl, briefly.
I thank Michelle Thompson for giving way. Just on the point that she made regarding the sort of balance of evidence, I would point out, and I think it has been reflected already in the debate, that we engaged in a balanced way, or that was our attempt to engage in a balanced way. And just on the point of the evidence from the Women's Support Project, our aspiration was for all engagement to be trauma-informed, and on that particular issue we would advise strongly not to engage directly with lived experience witnesses.
Michelle Thompson.
I thank the convener for that point, but the point I'm making is that by not doing it directly, whether or not you were advised, it gives different weight to the two different sides. And it's an academic point I'm making, actually. Now, I just want to make some progress and set out so that we are very clear about the decision we are making today. And I want to discuss some of the harms for women, and I accord respect to the women who are in the gallery today. The life they live is thus to be systematically raped vaginally, anally and orally multiple times a day, to be spat on, ejaculated on, urinated on and sometimes defecated on, to suffer repeated abrasions and injuries to their vagina and anus, often requiring medical treatment, to be at a high risk of being slapped, punched and 18 times more likely to be murdered, to be strangled, potentially until unconscious, often without even knowing that's happening, to be verbally abused by the people who pay for access to their body, to be at high risk of contracting STDs and other serious infections, to lose most of her earnings to the pimp controlling her, to become addicted to mind-numbing substances simply to endure the disassociation, to develop complex PTSD, and even if she escapes, to struggle for the rest of her life to form trusting relationships with men. But on the upside, to learn that her most valued skill is performing, because her rapists require her to act as though she enjoys what's being done to her. Who here, on that basis, would argue that this should be regularised? Who here would argue for the protection of the abusers rather than for the woman herself? And who here would tell a constituent who cannot afford to put food in their mouth that their solution is to put male members in their mouth? No one. We have privilege. The reality of prostitution will never permeate our lives, but it permeates the lives of the poor, the dispossessed, the trafficked, the vulnerable, the addicted, the homeless, the ones with no voice. Exactly the people we are meant to be speaking for here. Is the extent of our collective ambition for Scotland to make it a better place that we simply accept the entitlement of some men to demand the purchase of women? We are here as change makers, not just policy makers. And I wrote recently on X, it's my intention, of course you would have guessed, to vote for this bill at stage 1. My principled stance is that the sex-class women should not be legally bought as commodities and raped for money. And that is the nub of today's debate. We are wrestling with the principle of the commodification of women and the principle of male demand. Complexity cannot be an alibi for inaction. I agree it's complex, and many states have wrestled with it, but we are here. We should be, because we want Scotland to be better. So I ask all of you, particularly my colleagues, why are you here? We have the opportunity to choose courage over complacency. I know what I choose. Presiding officer, do you?
Thank you. Always through the chair, I think. I call Rhoda Grant, who's joining us remotely, to be followed by Stephen Kermis-Grant.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I don't think that there are many people in this chamber that would agree that another human being should be a commodity to be bought and sold. And neither do I believe that any of the people present here would believe that vulnerable people should be exploited. But what I do believe is that there are many people in the chamber that have not really thought through what prostitution is and its impacts. So can I ask them to consider if it was their mother, their sister, their daughter that was involved in prostitution, would they see it as an ordinary job then? And how would they regard the men that paid for access to their body? Would they believe that that payment bought consent? I ask everyone just to take a moment to think about that. I also ask them to think about the men who buy sex, often missed out of this whole debate. If anyone has seen the Invisible Men exhibition, they can't help but be horrified. Men reviewing women in prostitution, a kind of TripAdvisor for prostitution. Men complaining about the lack of enjoyment displayed by their victims. Men recognising that women they were abusing were being trafficked but doing nothing about it. And men talking about their abuse, forcing women to do things they clearly didn't want to do with no remorse. These men need to be held accountable for their abuse. And they're ordinary men. Many of them are married or in long-term relationships, yet they buy sex and have control over women. To ask them for things that other consenting adults would not do or gain any enjoyment from, it's completely selfish exploitation. And this bill seeks to stop that exploitation. Is it drafted perfectly? No. If it were, it would be the very first bill in this Parliament to be. There has never been a bill that has passed without amendment. Some are worse than others. We're not here today to make a judgment on that. We're here to make a judgment on the general principles of the bill, a bill that stops the gendered exploitation of women. This Parliament and the Scottish Government recognise that prostitution is violence against women. Yet it feels like many are looking for excuses not to address that violence. And if we truly believe this is violence against women, then the costs associated with the bill should never be a barrier. Those in our midst who say combating domestic abuse was too expensive, that we should shut domestic abuse courts, shut women's refuges, stop offering counselling. There is nobody in our midst that would do that, none of us. We know that prostitution is wrong and we need to combat it. Therefore, concerning ourselves with the cost of supporting people should be a reason for our shame, not a reason for us voting against the bill. These services supporting people should be in place now, right now, regardless of whether this bill proceeds. They must be put in place. We're not going to save. If we really believe that this is violence against women, we need to support women in prostitution. Stopping the exploited being criminalised again is something we should all be in favour of. Yet we recognise that prostitution is abuse and sit back and allow our laws to criminalise the victims for their own abuse. In what way is that right? I don't believe any of us would suggest it was. There will be issues about quashing convictions, but there are ways around that. Pardons have been offered in the past for activities that were once criminalised and now we see should never have been. And we can ensure that disclosure checks don't list past convictions for soliciting. And there are a myriad of other ways that this can be dealt with. What removing criminality from prostitution would do right now is to make sure that never again in Scotland is someone criminalised for their own abuse. And surely that's something we can all get behind. And then we come to the nub of the issue, the buyers that feed the demand for exploitation, that small minority of men who believe that they're entitled to sex, regardless whether their chosen partner wants to have sex with them or not. And that's rape. And yet I fear today that we'll allow these rapists to get off scot-free, that Is that the country that we really want to live in? Is that the country you want to bring up your daughters and granddaughters in? I really don't think any of us here would put our hands on our hearts and say yes. And if that's the case for you, then you must vote for the general principles of this bill. If that's the case, you can join the many others of us who will not accept this abuse. Join those who seek to protect future generations of women from men who treat them as commodities. And together we can make the change. So let's start by voting for this bill tonight.
Thank you, Ms Grant. I now call Stephen Kerr, who will have 4 minutes, to be followed by Ruth Maguire, who will also have 4 minutes. Mr Kerr.
Rhoda Grant is absolutely right, because I'm standing here at her invitation thinking of my daughter and my granddaughters and the kind of country that I want them to grow up in. And therefore, I don't see how this is a conundrum for any member of this Parliament to vote in favour of the principles of this bill tonight. And I am grateful to Michelle Thompson. I think she's given one of the most powerful speeches I have heard in this Parliament. And the reason I say that is because she's asking us to confront difficult, unspeakable truths. And it asks this Parliament, she is asking this Parliament, as is Ash Regan, to confront these realities that for too long we've been prepared to look past. For generations, it has been women who've been at the sharp end of prostitution laws. It's women who are prosecuted, women who are stigmatised, women who carry criminal records. Well, the men who used them, bought them, treated their bodies as commodities, were often able to do so without any kind of fear of criminal sanction. And that imbalance matters, not just legally, but morally. This bill starts from a simple principle: that women and girls should not be bought and sold. And a society that tolerates that, however quietly, is a society that has failed to uphold its own values. We cannot consider this legislation in isolation from the wider reality of the global sex trade. Prostitution doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists alongside trafficking, organised crime, coercion and exploitation. Women and girls are transported, displaced and controlled, and in some cases in conditions that are nothing short of slavery. Modern slavery, we might call it, but slavery nevertheless. And that is not rhetoric. It is the evidence presented to this Parliament and its members. And this bill before us seeks to address the demand side of that equation. Demand fuels trafficking. No demand, none of it exists. Demand sustains criminal gangs, creates a market in which exploitation thrives. If men face a real risk of prosecution for purchasing sexual access to another human being, the market changes. The incentives change. The profitability of abuse changes. And that approach is not unique to Scotland, as has been mentioned by other speakers. There are jurisdictions that have attempted to challenge demand precisely because they recognise that without doing so, exploitation simply continues under different forms. Now, I'm not standing here pretending this bill is perfect, because it isn't. But neither do I accept the argument from the government front bench that somehow there's no time left to amend this bill and make it workable. That's what the whole process of Stage 2 and later Stage 3 is about. And therefore, the Stage 1 question that we must all answer is whether or not we agree with the principle of eradicating, reducing, alleviating the terrible costs of prostitution in our country. Now, the bill's not perfect. There are legitimate questions that Liam Kerr eloquently described. But the timing of this Stage 1 debate, so close to the end of a session, become a convenient excuse for the government not to support it. These are not reasons to kill the bill tonight. They are reasons to take it forward and to amend it. And we owe it to the women whose evidence was heard by the Criminal Justice Committee, many of whom described the violence, the coercion and trauma that are the routine features of their lives, but nothing as eloquent and as powerful and as terrible as what Michelle Thompson described to us. So we owe it to ourselves as legislators not to allow party politics, personality, point scoring to dictate how we vote tonight. That is not scrutiny. That is not seriousness. That is small politics. Take the evidence, support the principle, advance the bill, and then we'll amend it.
Thank you, Mr Kerr. I now call Ruth Maguire, who will have 4 minutes, to be followed by Fergus Ewing, who will have 4 minutes. Ms Maguire.
I'm grateful to the presiding officers for giving me some space to make some remarks. If I can start by quoting Diane Martin, chair of a Model for Scotland and a survivor of prostitution. If we do nothing, we become complicit because we know the realities and we've turned away. Inaction preserves a system that harms and criminalises victims, enables perpetrators to exploit with impunity and maintains an organised, crime-driven market that has its eyes set on our children as either future commodities for sale or future sex buyers. Make no mistake, each vote cast will either be justice for vulnerable victims or continued abuse by vile and violent trade in bodies. Presiding officer, this bill moves forward or falls on the votes of SNP colleagues, and I will plea with them. I plea with those who recognise this injustice, who have perhaps spoken out previously very eloquently in this chamber, but are intending to hold their noses and vote against the principle of something they believe in, something that's SNP policy. I want them to know that they're on solid ground on this matter and ask them to vote with their conscience, and it is their conscience. It's the public, not the government or whips who elect you to this place, and your public will value courage over unquestioning compliance. Over at least the last 10 years, survivors, survivor-led organisations and frontline women's workers have provided testimony, they've provided expertise to the government in good faith to work that came to nothing. They contributed to Ash Regan's consultation, to the committee's consultation. They've given evidence publicly, reached out directly to their MSPs in writing and in person. They've spoken at events online, in Parliament and in their communities. Why on earth would we expect them to tell their stories again to a commission set up for some time in the future? It is time we got on with showing Diane Martin and all the other female survivors who have generously and bravely shown us the reality of prostitution. That we've listened to these brave women, that we understand, that we care. Colleagues, if this is something that you believe in, take a breath and do the right thing tonight. Presiding officer.
Thank you, Ms Maguire. I call Fergus Ewing, who will have 4 minutes, to be followed by Pam Gozo, who will also have 4 minutes. Mr Ewing.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In the 26 years since this Parliament was reconvened, I've attended every debate which is substantially, not entirely, but substantially involving a fundamental moral question. In those previous debates, generally, the reputation of this Parliament has been enhanced. The debates have been largely courteous, they have been thorough, and above all, they've had sufficient time to do justice to a most serious topic. We are not seeing that, sadly, today, because not of the presiding officer, but of the Bureau decision. Let's be quite clear about that. And when we're looking back in history, as I'm perhaps able to do, being rather older than most of you, we remember the poem by Edwin Morgan, who gave advice to MSPs. Do you remember the famous advice about what we don't want in Scotland? What we don't want is a nest of fearties. What we don't want is a symposium of procrastinators. That's a sort of legal phrase. Maybe he was a lawyer as well as a poet. But the serious point is this. We're not doing justice to ourselves today, and we're certainly not doing justice to the people of Scotland. But far worse than that, we are really allowing the continuance of the most vile, abhorrent abuse of women that is imaginable. And it's happening as we speak all over our country. And I can't match the eloquence of Pauline McNeill, of Michelle Thompson, of others who have contributed and described graphically these things. They don't really bear too much reputation. But I do think that the arguments against the bill at this stage, and Stephen Kerr, Michelle Thompson, really have destroyed the arguments for voting against this bill at stage one. They have destroyed it. Yeah. We have won the argument. It's clear. Yeah. But, well, I'm very sorry. I haven't really got lots of time, and so there we are. But the convener of the committee said one of the points was that it's going to be difficult to enforce. Well, rape is difficult to prove. Yep. Do we not have the crime of rape because it's difficult to prove? Yeah. What a pathetic argument. Of course certain crimes are difficult to prove, and many more crimes go unenforced. That's not a reason not to criminalise behaviour which is abhorrent to any right-thinking person in a democratic society. That is the purpose of public law, of criminal law, in a democracy, to ensure civilisation, to ensure protection of the weakest. And that is the issue today, as we've heard. And I was moved, more than I can say, by the testimonies of Vanessa, Jenna, Chelsea and others that I listened to in the past 2 days. I'm very surprised that the police yesterday, after 186 days, came forward with a totally wild estimate of the costs. And I'm just bound to ask, were they invited so to do by anybody in the government? Were any civil servants asking? It would be very helpful if you could give us this information. It sounds to me, let's use a carefully crafted phrase, improbably coincidental.
Mr. Ewing is concluding.
I have very little time, and I want to say a couple of more things before I close. Alone in the history of this institution, Ash Regan resigned on a point of principle. She gave up her job, her title, her salary, the ministerial car, all these things, because she believed in women and she stood up for women. And she's doing that again today. She is somebody of whom every female in this country, every young girl should be proud. And my plea to you all today, in the SNP, ignore the whips, follow your conscience, do what is right, let right be done.
Thank you, Mr Ewing. I now call Pam Gozo, who will have 4 minutes to be followed by Douglas Ross, who will have 2 minutes. Ms Gozo.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Before I begin, I would like to thank Ash Regan for bringing forward the Prostitution, Offences and Support Scotland Bill, and to acknowledge her passion and all her hard work she has done on this bill and on the rights of women and girls generally. Introducing a private member's bill is not an easy process, especially when you are in opposition. And having gone through the process myself, I understand the complexities that this entails. I would also like to thank all the organisations that have supported the development of this bill and that have provided briefings for today's Stage 1 debate. Protecting women and girls is an issue of the utmost importance, and for the past 5 years has been one of my #1 priorities. Prostitution is an issue primarily affecting women, and today we have heard across the chamber prostitution is violence against women and girls. Presiding Officer, prostitution is commercialised, often involves systematic rape, and many of the people who sell sexual acts endure numerous human rights violations when doing so. This bill aims to stop that by criminalising the buyers of sex as opposed to the seller. This approach, commonly referred to as the Nordic model, has been approved in many countries, with the evidence suggesting that in those countries it has been successful. Presiding Officer, the general principles of Ash Regan's unbuyable bill are in the right place. And that is why it is so important that this bill is given the proper scrutiny it needs now, and should it make to stage 2 and 3 with the proper set of amendments. The Minister has made it clear that the SNP Scottish Government does not support this bill due to the so-called lack of time. But when it suits them, there is time to debate bills with hundreds and hundreds of amendments. We never heard any issues then of time. For example, The doomed Gender Recognition Reform Bill, the SNP forced the MSPs to sit in this chamber and vote until early hours of the morning. I am still bearing the bruises of the First Minister not backing my Prevention of Domestic Abuse Scotland bill and killing it before the Stage 1 report was issued. I know all too well what it means to work hard work for the 3.5 years for a bill, and so does Ash Regan. With regards to bills focusing on issues such as female genital mutilation, non-fatal strangulation and misogyny, the SNP have decided to kick the can down the road. At the same time, Part 2 of the Domestic Abuse Protection Scotland Act 2021 are still not in force. Presiding Officer, what have all these bills have in common is the aim of protecting women and girls, which the SNP government do not want to do, whether that is through members' bills or through their own bills. This is an SNP government that can't even define the word woman. To conclude, Presiding Officer, it was my intention to speak a bit more about this bill, but, surprise, surprise, there is no time for that. Sex workers are some of the most marginalised women in Scotland and have often been coerced into soliciting their bodies. The general principles of this bill aim to put a halt to this horrible practice. Therefore, I will be supporting this bill at Stage 1, and I would encourage all MSPs to consider breaking your whip and vote for this bill today.
Thank you, Ms Gozzo. I now call Douglas Ross for up to 2 minutes, to be followed by Graham Simpson for up to 2 minutes. Mr Ross.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm personally grateful to you for calling me, but I just think we are in a terrible state in this Parliament if legislators are restricted to just 2 minutes on an important piece of legislation. So I can't go through the normalities. I would like to praise the member in charge here. She has done incredible work. I want to get to the root of where we are tonight and at decision time. And I just can't get my head around the government position on this. What is being asked for tonight is simply to agree the general principles, not to get into the detail of the bill. That comes later. And the general principles are agreed by this government. It's agreed by the party of government. So why are they opposing it? And I've thought about it quite a lot, and it maybe comes down to politics, or perhaps Fergus Ewing was right. It comes down to personalities. This government bears a grudge on anyone that steps out of line. And you don't step further out of line than resigning ministerial office by saying to the First Minister at the time, Nicola Sturgeon, that her Gender Recognition Reform Act was a mess and was going to ruin the safety of women and girls. To resign from government, that has consequences. And sadly, I think years later, the consequences are going to be felt by some of the most vulnerable women and girls in Scotland, because this government is still holding a grudge against the member in charge who was brave enough to step down at that time. And I've only got 30 more seconds. We have heard from SNP members tonight who are going to break the whip. We have heard, I believe, from one SNP member who has spoken up in support of the position. Where are the rest? If they are happy to vote this bill down tonight, to simply say they don't agree with the general principles, tell us why. But we haven't heard from them. They've been silent. They've taken up more of their speaking time with one individual member.
Mr Ross is concluding, Ms Mackay.
They've taken up more of their speaking time with one individual member because I think the whips have been struggling even to get their cannon fodder to stand up and tell them why they're supporting the government. And that is a reflection that I wouldn't like to take. I'm standing down, and I'm just about to finish, Presiding Officer. I'm standing down from this Parliament. But even as someone standing down, not knocking on doors in the next few weeks asking for support, I'm proud how I will vote tonight to progress this bill. But any SNP member who is not returning here, or any SNP member about to embark on the campaign trail,
thank you.
They should do so knowing that their vote tonight will come up on the doorsteps. Thank you.
I am actually trying to accommodate everybody who's pressed the button, but to do that I need their cooperation to stick to the time that they've now agreed to. Mr Simpson, up to 2 minutes, to be followed by Rachel Hamilton, and we've agreed up to 1 minute.
I'm most grateful. Presiding Officer, the government's stance today is both bizarre and incoherent, because the Minister, right at the start, seemed to suggest that they actually agree with the aims of the bill. She said men should not be able to buy sex, but they're arguing that there isn't enough time to get the details right. That's irrelevant. And they'll do it themselves anyway if they're back in government. And they won't help the member involved. This is a new and worrying tactic that's being employed to thwart members with sensible ideas. It's clear to me the government's acting in this way because they don't want Ash Regan to have any success, because she had the temerity to leave the SNP. This is not how to do legislation. If the government agrees with the intent behind this bill, they should be supporting it now, because we're only voting on the general principles, and those principles are sound. The legislation seeks to confront exploitation, reduce harm, deliver long overdue protection for some of the most vulnerable people in society. It recognises a simple truth: prostitution is not a harmless transaction, but a system of commercial sexual exploitation driven overwhelmingly by male demand. It's not work, as Maggie Chapman would have us believe. By criminalising the purchase of sex while removing penalties from those who sell it, this bill shifts responsibility to where it belongs, on the men, mainly, who fuel the trade, not the women, who are so often coerced, marginalised or trapped by their circumstances. This Parliament today has an opportunity to reduce harm, challenge misogyny and stand with survivors. Colleagues should reject the government's flawed logic and back the general principles.
Thank you, Mr Simpson. And I call Rachel Hamilton. 1 minute, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, for the opportunity, and thank you to Ash Regan. The Scottish Government have had plenty of time to consider this bill. It was introduced 9 months ago. They've had plenty of sitting days to look at it. I believe they had a choice, and they didn't take that choice. They chose not to take this forward. They chose not to support women. The Minister used the excuse in her contribution that she didn't have official support. What or who is this official support? Was it a dark force? Was it the First Minister, John Swinney? Was it another party? Because key organisations like Police Scotland and Rima Salem are supportive of it. There must be someone pulling the strings, and whomever they are, they have a problem with women. They're shutting down women's voices. No wonder so many women are leaving this Parliament. The Greens are also showing their true colours. They did it during the gender recognition reform, and they're at it again. Maggie Chapman's views are offensive to women, especially women who carry trauma from sexual assault. Presiding Officer, I want to distance myself from their appalling views. And I also want to say that I believe that they think that prostitution is the only acceptable form of driving the economy, from what Maggie Chapman said. The
Ms Hamilton, you need to conclude.
Support the unbuyable bill. The SNP and Green opposition to the bill sets a dangerous precedent. Tonight, I believe that we should come together, we should look at this, we should support women, and we should back the bill.
Thank you, Ms Hamilton. We will now move to closing speeches. I call on Maggie Chapman to close on behalf of the Scottish Greens. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I want to, in my closing contribution, thank the Criminal Justice Committee members, clerks and SPICE researchers for their careful work during stage 1 of this bill. I appreciate their efforts to hear from a wide range of witnesses, those who share my view on this bill, as well as those who strongly and sincerely support the legislation. And to all those witnesses, I am very grateful to you for sharing your sometimes painful and harrowing stories, for speaking candidly of your experiences, and for making your voices heard. I want to address some of the points raised this afternoon. Firstly, that of the apparent lack of evidence that the Nordic model does not cause harm. Norway criminalised clients in 2009. Amnesty International's 2016 research found that sex workers are still criminalised, including for working together for safety, and they face forced evictions, investigations, surveillance, prosecutions and increased stigma, with migrant workers particularly targeted. And 2022 research found that Nordic model legislation was a smokescreen for punitive and racialised policing, where sex workers were targeted for deportations and evictions. In France, which criminalised clients in 2016, Médecins du Monde's 2018 report found that since the law was introduced, 63% of sex workers have experienced deterioration of their living conditions, more isolation and greater stress. 42% are more exposed to violence, sexual violence, theft and armed robbery. 38% have found it increasingly hard to demand use of condoms. That sounds like pretty clear evidence to me. Turning to the matter of enforcement, when we create new crimes, we must be sure that they are not only justified, but workable. Evidence presented to the committee calls this into question. Whilst I accept Police Scotland supports the bill, Detective Superintendent Bertram's evidence to the committee showed that the police are not yet clear on how they would be able to tell if a crime had happened. And they raised the issue of capacity, as he reported that Police Scotland also struggled to respond to all reports of brothel keeping, never mind an entirely new offence. The Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service said that it can foresee difficulty in proving the accused intention in circumstances where the offence takes place off-street and where there is no admission. In such cases, whilst the Crown Office would not wish to add to the trauma experienced by those exploited by prostitution, their evidence may be required to prove the accused intention. This echoes sex workers' concerns that they will inevitably be dragged into investigations in order for the purchase offence to be proven. Ash Regan therefore wants us to introduce a crime that the police and our prosecution service do not know how they will investigate or prosecute. Moving to some of the other parts of the bill. It is clear that Greens do not support the primary purpose of this bill, but there are parts that, guided by sex workers, we would support. Greens would welcome, for instance, the abolition of the offence of solicitation. As National Ugly Mugs have said, repeal would reduce stigma and criminalisation, improve access to justice and help to build trust between sex workers and Police Scotland. It follows that we should indeed quash any historical offences. We know from evidence given by Scotland Footy Crim that, and I quote, having a criminal record with prostitution-related convictions and or a police warning makes it much more difficult for people to leave sex work. Employers are likely to rescind offers of employment, or the worker can be barred from certain forms of employment if they have to undergo a Disclosure Scotland check. With 10,459 people having been convicted under the soliciting offence since 1982, that would be a major piece of work, but important work to undo a major injustice. But the main aim of this bill, Presiding Officer, is something we cannot support. I cannot support a proposal that people with lived experience, yes, people with an interest in this proposed legislation, have told us will make them more vulnerable, will put them at risk of further harm, will create additional stigma. I hosted an event with Scotland Footy Crim in Parliament last year, and sex workers then were clear. This bill will make them more isolated, more stigmatised, more at risk. It will push already marginalised people further into the shadows. It will empower traffickers and abusers who will be able to capitalise on those forced underground. And it will make sex workers who need help less likely or able to seek help and support. Presiding Officer, criminalisation is not a gift of protection. It is a threat to the rights of working people. Scotland Footy Crim makes the case for safety, not criminalisation, for rights, not rescue. And I will close with the words of a sex worker currently working in Scotland. As someone who does sex work in Scotland, I find the Prostitution Bill deeply offensive. In 2024, it is standard procedure to give the people you are legislating a voice. It is patronising. It is based on sensationalist stereotypes of sex work. Sex workers in Scotland have been organising for workers' rights for years. We are well informed. The Nordic model is harmful to workers. We have clear demands, full decriminalisation. We are resilient and organised people, not powerless victims, as we are portrayed in this proposal. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Chapman. I now call on Katie Clark to close on behalf of Scottish Labour. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'm pleased to close this debate on behalf of Scottish Labour. Ash Regan has spoken about the number of attempts to get legislation through this Parliament. And given their previous commitments, it is therefore disappointing that the Scottish Government have not brought forward their own legislation in this Parliament, or indeed engaged meaningfully with this member's bill. And I agree with Fergus Ewing, this Parliament needs to show courage. We all know that prostitution involves abuse and violence. Michelle Thompson spoke about this in graphic detail, and indeed the importance of lived experience evidence. We also know that most buyers of sex are men and most sellers of sex are women, and that in Scots law, the women are criminalised and the men's behaviour is deemed lawful. We also know that there is a global, multi-billion-pound sex trade which profits from the exploitation of some of the most vulnerable in society and is closely connected with human trafficking and organised crime. In the UK, one study found that around two-thirds of those involved in prostitution and sex work had been assaulted by clients. As Polly McNeill said, survivors of prostitution have described experiencing long-term trauma, hypervigilance and symptoms consistent with complex PTSD. In 2015, potential victims of trafficking for sexual exploitation comprised a third of all referrals to the National Referral Mechanism, the UK's support system for victims of modern slavery. The status quo is unacceptable, and so we welcome that Ash Regan has brought this bill forward today and thank her for her considerable work which has been involved, because we appreciate the lack of support there is for members taking forward bills of this nature. And we also consider that it's a good use of this Parliament's time to consider the legal framework in Scots law. We appreciate that this is a polarised debate with strong views on different sides, and have listened very carefully to the arguments. We note the lack of men that have been involved in giving evidence to the committee, and the obvious lack of direct lobbying from those who profit from this highly lucrative sector. It doesn't seem that those that profit from the sex trade thought it was a good use of their time to attempt to influence the evidence that was given to us directly. We are also aware that this debate is happening after the release of another tranche of the Epstein files, and it's clear from the evidence that the committee did get that men from all walks of life buy sex. We are also very aware that there are 4 parts of this bill, and that Section 1 of the bill tends to dominate the debate. Section 1, of course, proposes the criminalisation of the purchase of sex. But there are 3 other parts of the bill: the legalisation of soliciting, the quashing of convictions for soliciting, and the creation of a legal right to support to exit prostitution. And we believe that all 4 parts of this bill need proper consideration. We also know that there has been legislative change in many other countries in recent decades, with both the so-called Nordic model being introduced in some countries and decriminalisation in others. We appreciate that the evidence is highly contested, but there is evidence that the Nordic model has had an effect of reducing the size of the market, the number of men buying sex, and reducing human trafficking. And that in countries where there's been decriminalisation, this size of the market has increased. And there is some evidence that less men buy sex, and, for example, Ash Regan's used the example of Sweden, saying that in 2008, 8% of men reported paying for sexual services, compared with 13% before they brought in this legislation. So, we accept that there is a great deal of dispute about the evidence, but we're also very clear that many survivors in Scotland are saying clearly to us that they believe that this framework is one that needs consideration. This Parliament also needs to consider the wider impact of the status quo on society as a whole, on girls and women, and indeed on boys and men, a point made to me by one of the survivors of the sex trade. We've looked at the bill in detail. We believe that there is a need to amend each of the 4 parts of the bill. We have proposals as to how it could be amended. I know the member herself is intending to come forward with amendments. So we believe this bill can be amended, but most of all, we believe that this is too important a debate for the Scottish Parliament to curtail scrutiny of the bill that we have before us today, and therefore will support the general principles of the bill when it comes to a division.
Thank you, Ms Clark. I now call on Tess White to close on behalf of the Scottish Conservatives. Up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Thank you to Ash Regan for her courage and her incredible team, and thank you also for the survivors of prostitution who shared their harrowing stories with MSPs. Today in Scotland, we vote as a Parliament for the principles of this bill to put an end to state-sanctioned torture of women and girls. This bill responds to evidence of serious harm, evidence from women whose lives have been shaped by exploitation and violence. And I speak today as someone whose views on this issue have changed. When I lived in the Netherlands shortly after prostitution was legalised, I accepted the argument that regulation would improve safety and reduce abuse. Brothels were licensed and standards enforced to protect those selling sex. However, over time, I saw the horrific outcomes as they became apparent. Sex tourism increased. More women were being violated. Organised crime became entrenched, and human trafficking got worse. In my own region today, there are pop-up brothels in towns, women trafficked, and alarming indicators of exploitation. We know there are links between prostitution, grooming gangs, and serious organised crime. In 2025, a Romanian gang was convicted in Dundee for trafficking, rape, and sexual abuse connected to prostitution. And these are not isolated incidents, Presiding Officer. The central issue, as we've heard today, is demand. Pam Gossel outlined that prostitution exists because men are enabled to buy sex, rape, and abuse women and girls. As long as that demand is left unchallenged, exploitation and harm continues. This bill seeks to address that reality directly by shifting responsibility away from the abused onto the abusers, those who create the demand and those who profit from it. Concerns have been raised about prostitution being driven underground, yet it is not borne by evidence from countries such as Sweden. Traffickers and pimps depend on visibility and access. Their profits rely on men being able to purchase and abuse women easily. Reducing demand reduces the scale of harm and exploitation. As we've heard today, Ash Regan pointed out that sexual exploitation exists because those with the power choose not to act. Liam Kerr and Pam Gossel challenged the argument laid down that Parliament doesn't have the time. Liam Kerr gave example upon example of where extra time was made at the beginning of the day and the end of the day, and so too Pam Gossel. Now, Presiding Officer, I'm not allowed to say that this is a lie, but this, Presiding Officer, is a misrepresentation of the truth by this Scottish Government. Ruth Maguire, actually, Ruth, thank you for your intervention on Maggie Chapman, because we were cringing. I mean, my colleague said that it was just offensive, but we cringed as we listened to Maggie Chapman eulogise about sex work. And thank you, Ruth Maguire, because you asked if this was the case, should we set up work experience And I think, Ruth Maguire, you showed how ridiculous Maggie Chapman was. And Rona Mackay, I'd say to Rona Mackay, she tried several times to actually intervene. Prostitution and the violence from prostitution is not a myth. I'm afraid I won't take an intervention to my colleague, Rhoda Grant. Thank you, Rhoda Grant, because you actually made us pause for a moment. You said to us, if this was your mother or your sister or your daughter, how would you feel? And my colleague Stephen Kerr said, is this a country we want to bring our daughters and our granddaughters in? The SNP has been in power for 2 decades. Fergus Ewing said today that what has become is a nest of theatres, and I agree with that. The argument of this government has been destroyed today, Presiding Officer. The SNP government condemned violence against women and girls, yet prostitution is a form of violence and it has never been tackled by this SNP in its legislation. This bill would reduce demand, disrupt organised crime and crucially provide a framework for better support to those who want to exit prostitution. It's supported by a long list of organisations, including the Crown Office, Police Scotland and Scottish
Ms White, you will need to conclude.
And finally, in closing, at its core, Presiding Officer, this bill is about the protection of vulnerable women and girls and reducing organised crime, including grooming and human trafficking. Let right be done today. Don't be cannon fodder for your whips, I say to the SNP, who are just sitting there looking at me.
Ms White, you will need to conclude.
A vote for this bill at stage one is a vote to support the general principles.
We are well over our time and we must make some progress. I now call on Minister Siobhan Brown to close on behalf of the Scottish Government. Up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Now, I share the passion and the drive that is clearly evident from all of today's contributions. This is self-evidently a really complex and sensitive issue that needs addressed in a way that everyone can agree on, in particular women involved in prostitution. Ms Regan and other members have spoken in defence of Ms Regan's bill, but what cannot be ignored are the voices of women involved in prostitution that have said that they will be at risk of violence and harm if this legislation is introduced. I'm going to try and make some progress, please. We've got around 22 sitting days left in this Parliament. Do members really believe that there is enough time to sufficiently address that concern, as well as many other flaws that have been highlighted in the bill? I'm clear that we cannot dismiss the comments from women involved in prostitution, and I quote, "They are terrified of these proposals." That should make us all pause. Members have received many briefings ahead of today that highlights those risks, and I appreciate there's a very divided opinion on these. I'm not taking interventions at this stage. I've got a lot to get through. One example, and I quote, make life more dangerous and difficult for those selling sex by driving the industry underground. And there was an open letter to MSPs that I mentioned, well, I was going to mention in my opening, but I didn't get a chance, that 126 signatories said, for us this means our working conditions worsening and the rate of violence we experience rising. We ask that you vote against this bill. I will take an intervention from the member.
Ash Regan.
Thank the Minister for taking an intervention. The logic seems to be, from those on the other side of the argument, that if you decriminalise, let's say, similar crimes like you decriminalise rapists or you decriminalise domestic abusers, that somehow that will make women safer. Surely they can understand that is not the case, that we need to hold these men to account to reduce the level of violence.
Minister.
Not been our argument, Ms Regan, whatsoever. Anyway, that's why I am supportive of the committee's recommendation to establish an independent commission on this issue. As importantly, this will allow for further engagement with women that are involved currently in selling sex and would offer opportunity to hear from those with technical experience on how to best respond to the issue on online exploitation, and also specifically about the support that they need, that we have no detail currently in this bill. And if it was to move forward, we would not have any time to consult or engage with women in prostitution at the moment. Further work is also clearly needed to ensure that future legislation is deliverable for police, and I'm sure many of you will be aware of the concerns Police Scotland raised yesterday about operational costings which could arise from the bill as outlined. I would like to highlight one thing, just in reflection of what Fergus Ewing had said regarding the announcement yesterday from Police Scotland. That was the first time I had seen those figures, and I am told it was in response to a question that was asked in the committee on the 5th of November last year by Mrs Dowie from the Conservatives. Further work is also clearly needed to ensure that future legislation is deliverable for police, and I am sure many of you will be aware of. We've also heard about the issues with the bill as drafted on the definition on the criminal aspect of the bill as well as enforcement. One of the examples is the Law Society of Scotland, which does not take a position on any of the policy intentions of the bill in their briefings to MSPs state, and I quote, "We envisage that the behaviours excluded from the scope of the proposed offence may lead to confusion, and agree with the committee Stage 1 recommendation that any new proposed offence should," and I quote again, "have a clear definition consistent with the current legislation and policy intentions of the bill." I'm going to reflect on some of the contributions from members today, which I appreciate. They're very emotive, but I do feel that some members have been very disingenuous with some of the facts that have been portrayed here in the thing. Liam Kerr. One of the reasons that you're saying that we have time for all these amendments, and you were referred to
always through the chair, please,
and Justice Reform Bill. That was introduced in June 2023, and it was late last year that finally went through. So that was a bill that went through over 2 years. There's also another over a dozen bills to go through in the next 22 days. Pauline McNeill, I'm going to address some of the things that you have
always
highlighted.
Through the chair, please, Minister.
Sorry, Presiding Officer. You mentioned the evolving landscape.
Always through the chair, please, Minister.
Pauline McNeill, the member mentioned the evolving digital landscape with women being filmed. That was on the news yesterday, and I think this just reiterates that we need the expertise to feed that into the discussions on how we move forward with the bill. I know that the member Katie Clark and Pauline did ask about why this was legislation was a programme for government. I have to clarify that there was a commitment in the 2020 to 2021 programme for government to consult on challenging men's demand in relation to prostitution. This led to, within the 2021-22 programme for government, to develop a model for Scotland which effectively tackles and challenges men's demand for prostitution, and we published that strategic approach back in 2024. But let me say, we are crystal clear as a government that this
Minister, please resume your seat for a second.
Continue.
I have a point of order from Pauline McNeill. Pauline McNeill.
I apologise for raising a point of order during a speech. I would never do that. But the Minister started her sentence by saying, "I'll name the members who've been disingenuous." Now, I don't know if she meant that to me, but I think I'm owed an apology, because what I said was what I believe, and I will not stand here and be called disingenuous by the Minister, because I thought we actually shared some common ground on the fact that the wider harm to women is something we all agree with. So, can I have an apology, please?
Could I respond, please, to Ms McNeill's point of order? I thank Ms McNeill for her point of order. That is indeed a point of order. And, of course, in terms of our standing orders, all members, including ministers, are required to treat every other member with courtesy and respect. And I hope the Minister has noted that point.
Sorry, it was just some of the comments that came from other members and not all comments that I was addressing. So, no, I do apologise, and it was not meant for that member. Presiding Officer, in my opening, I mentioned the Operation Begonia, and also there's a Crime Stoppers campaign that will be launched on the 23rd of February on commercial sexual exploitation. In addition, we've also funded the development of a resource to support police training, which will be introduced this year. Police Scotland highlighted during their committee evidence that the importance of the local support and how it will go hand in hand with their work. This new resource will build build on the work we have been undertaking with Police Scotland to strengthen the connections between police and local support services. Next month, as part of our wider work to improve support, we will also launch an employability and training guide for women who are looking to exit prostitution. As I said earlier, £400,000 in our draft budget to provide support in this area, with a further £65,000 being provided to Women's Support Project, supporting women exiting prostitution. Presiding Officer, can I commend Ash Regan for ensuring this Parliament has recognised the need to change the legislation around prostitution, and that for the majority there is an agreement around the fundamental principle of criminalising the purchase of sex. However, we have also heard about significant concerns with the bill that would take time to address. Time is not available in this parliamentary session.
The Minister is concluding.
We have heard consensus, and this is an issue that needs addressed in the next Parliament. A commission that can examine and consider the many issues on such legislation and act quickly in the next session, many of which have been aired today, is the way forward ahead of legislation that this Parliament can scrutinise and amend, knowing that they have the time. And importantly, that the proposals have been developed with those involved in prostitution. Women have clearly stated in the bill as drafted that would put them at an increased risk of violence. I do not think that in 6 short weeks the bill can be amended sufficiently to allay those concerns and the other flaws in the bill.
Members, the Minister needs to conclude. It is that clear concern for women's safety that the committee has heard, that MSPs have reflected on today, and which several stakeholders have outlined in their briefings, that I cannot and I will not dismiss. It is that which needs to be at the forefront of our minds today, and which is why the Scottish Government cannot support Stage 1 today. Thank you, Minister. And I now call on Ash Regan, the member in charge, to wind up the debate. Up to 8 minutes, please.
Well, it's been an interesting afternoon. I would reiterate my point that I think the Parliament is at its best when we are wrestling with these type of debates. But it is very clear to me this afternoon that the approach that I'm outlining in my bill today has won the argument decisively in this chamber this afternoon. There have been excellent speeches from Michelle Thompson, from Nisha Maguire, Fergus Ewing and Stephen Kerr. And what we haven't heard, though, is we haven't heard from the buyers. Now, this bill criminalises the purchase of sexual access, yet throughout the committee scrutiny, throughout the evidence, the people whose behaviour would be criminalised are very conspicuous by their absence. There were no sex buyers, there were no men coming in front of the committee to account and justify why they believe that their power entitles them to purchase access to another human being's body. And that matters, because when concerns are raised about safety, as they have been again today, and we're told again and again that criminalising men will make women less safe, and that sellers will screen more carefully, and that women will be forced to vet in order to survive. But let's be very honest here about this. Screening is not a safety measure. It is an attempt at a survival strategy which is used by women to try to navigate all the risks that are stacked against them, created by male entitlement, power and demand. It doesn't offer protection from violence. And I'm sorry, Minister, but if you had taken the time to listen to survivors, then the Minister might have heard people explaining that point to them. But there's a question here that's never answered. If men are refused by those at the very top that are able to do some kind of vetting, where do those men go next? Well, I'll tell you where they go. They just go down the chain to women that are poorer, women that are more desperate and women that are more vulnerable. So, this is a choice. Too many people in prostitution don't have a choice. They don't have agency. They don't have an ability to plead. And we're told that sex buyers are ordinary men, and I believe they are. They're men who want privacy, but the evidence, and that's academic and operational and survivor-led, tells us a different story. And the Lord Advocate put it in her written evidence to the committee. She said that women involved in prostitution are disproportionately likely...
Ms Regan, could you please resume your seat for a second? Point of order, testimony.
Presiding Officer, under the rules it says that MSPs need to show respect to other MSPs. There's a conversation going on beside me by a Cabinet Secretary and Minister while I'm trying to listen to Ash Regan's closing speech, which I think is disrespectful. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms White. I have noted your contribution. Obviously, every member would wish to extend courtesy and respect to all other members, and we should all be paying attention to the member who has the floor. Ms Regan.
So the women are disproportionately likely to be victims of serious offences, but the men who purchase sex, and that's whether it's on street or off street, are statistically more likely to be perpetrators of domestic abuse and other forms of violence against women and girls. And then she says it's therefore essential that the issue is considered within the broader context of public interest and societal harm. This isn't ideology. This is Scotland's chief legal officer, who is speaking from her evidence in a long career as a sexual crimes prosecutor, and the academic literature also aligns with this. Across countries and for decades, men who buy sexual access score higher on sexual entitlement, acceptance of coercion, hostility towards women and rape myth acceptance, which is one of the strongest predictors of sexual aggression. So what does this look like in their own words? One buyer describes meeting a woman who is visibly unwell and disoriented. He said, "She looked like she was under the effect of chemicals. She was disorientated when I tried to talk to her, but I decided to give her a go anyway." Another writes, "It truly is like living in a fantasy world, getting to pick from a range of girls to suck my cock and be fucked by me. All my teenage fantasies right there." We hear again and again and again the language of ownership, the language of consumption and the language of contempt. Another punter, "If you want the best head, a junkie will do it best. I saw her when she was homeless. She wore that bikini for weeks on end, and I would fuck her unshaven, unkempt, unshowered. I'd do it again if I had the chance. She is an object placed there for men like us to use. And when women do not perform enthusiasm, they're punished, financially and verbally." Another review, "Avoid. Let her learn the hard way that there's no such thing as a free lunch." This is the mentality of the men you are being asked to protect by not backing my bill. Evidence suggests that about 11% of men have bought sex. These figures are out of date. I think it's higher now. Most of them are in relationships and economically stable. Many hold positions of authority and power: head teachers, senior professionals, princes, politicians. Police and prosecutors understand, and they see the pattern repeatedly. They back my bill. Men arrested for sexual assault often turn out to be sex buyers. Domestic abuse perpetrators frequently have a history of buying sex. Men stopped for curb crawling already have previous offending against women, and digital evidence shows patterns of purchasing surfacing across different crimes. Demand for sexual access is not a separate behaviour. It sits as part of this wider continuum of violence against women and girls, and that is why the Nordic model is such a game changer, because it doesn't criminalise the sellers. Me and Maggie Chapman have got that in common. It doesn't pretend to manage the harm. It targets the demand, the entitlement that drives this very system. And if we fail to pass this bill, we're not protecting women's safety, we're protecting men's violence. We are shielding those minority of men who, their own words, reveal exactly what they believe women to be for. So let's be clear that hiding sex buyers behind claims of women's safety is not protection, it's exploitation. And this silence that the buyers hide behind, it's not innocence, it's entitlement enforced by power. So the presiding officer, the Parliament now has to decide who it stands with: the exploited or the exploiter. My bill is 4.5 pages long. It's got 11 sections in it, and that's even including the title. And with all the issues raised at the committee, and I have listened carefully at stage one, and I've committed to a number of amendments to address those issues, the government haven't articulated one issue to me that I hadn't already covered in my various conversations with the Minister. Yep. And if it's a matter of money, what price do they put on the safety of women and girls? Yep. I even presented a Christie Commission public value case to the government, showing that this bill will actually save Scotland money. And if it's a bill for a law backed by Police Scotland, backed by the Crown Office, the UN Special Rapporteur, the Lord Advocate, enforced in 8 countries over 26 years, it's the government's own strategy. And if this is beyond the capability of this Parliament and 128 MSPs in the 2 remaining months of a 5-year Parliament, the public are going to ask us, what are we doing here? I got to this stage 1 debate with just my own small team, alongside brave survivors, many of whom are here today, and a network of women's rights and child safeguarding campaigners. Thank you. Doing what women have always done when those in power fail to act on our behalf. They organise at kitchen tables between dinner and tea. I've had no government or privately funded lobby groups. I've not even had the NGBU resource that the public would assume that the public purse would fund for all members' bills.
Shocking.
I've had radio silence from the government on technical issues that are within their own control, and even on requests from survivors to meet with the government, which is shameful. I'm sorry, Presiding Officer, but it is shameful. I've been a government minister for 4 years and a backbencher 5 in this very place, and I have to tell you, colleagues, I have never been more ashamed of the lack of courage that is being displayed in this place to even not meet with survivors of exploitation. That's happening. It's probably happening, metres from this building, let alone to stand up and be counted on a matter that is life or death. This isn't about greyhound tracks that are not operational. This is about life or death for vulnerable women and girls. But, Parliament's too busy. The state had a duty to protect them from the sexual exploitation of abusive, dangerous men. And if it doesn't act, I'm afraid you're all going to be complicit in this harm. And as I look around this chamber this evening, I see some MSPs sitting here who know that they should register an interest. But they won't, I'm sure, for varying reasons. Yet this is not a conscience vote, but I believe it should be, as other members' bills have been. And I see former colleagues and friends as well on the benches who I know back this bill, who support this principle. And I wonder if they have the courage to say so with their votes. I hope they do. Millicent Fawcett famously said that courage calls to courage. Well, the most courageous people in this place today are the survivors of prostitution, who have called to us all. They've bared their deepest trauma and shame in the hope that we will listen to them, in the hope that we will save the next wee girls that are targeted to have their bodies accessed by entitled, abusive sex buyers. Will you finally heed their call to courage? Will you listen? Will you act for them? MSPs who hide behind the polished lies that are directly out of the sex trades handbook should frankly be ashamed. And I just want to address the point of harm. The only thing that's going to be harmed by my bill is the sex trade. And there's no excuse not to apply critical thinking and research to this debate, as other legislatures, even in the UK, have done and told us about. And they are watching this Parliament today.
Ms Regan, you will need to conclude.
What rational person thinks that vulnerable are kept safe by shielding the men who have queued around the block to buy access to these wee girls' bodies and then rape them like takeaway meals on the vile punternet community sites? There are sliding door moments in politics, and today is one of those sliding door moments. Yes. I gave survivors, ignored for generations, a voice in their national parliament. Now it's over to you. What are you going to do? Are you going to listen? You're going to act, or are you going to stand with shielding sex buyers and tolerating the collateral damage that they inflict? If that's for you, then that will have to be between you and your conscience. Yep. Survivors don't want your praise,
Ms.
Minister.
Regan, please
they
conclude.
don't want your sympathy. They just need your vote. So, those who vote against this bill today, I think you will find that this will go on to be a stain on your voting record. And I'd like
Ms
to think
Regan,
about that.
you will need to have your conclusion now.
So for all the survivors of prostitution in Scotland, here and across the world, I move this motion in my name.
Thank you, Ms Regan. That concludes the debate on the Prostitution, Offences and Support Scotland Bill at Stage 1. It is now time to move on to the next item of business. And there will be a very short pause before we do so.